Well, let's just stay with that car story for a moment, because President Trump has complained that Europeans do not buy American cars, but there are some practical reasons why that is the case. First and foremost, size. US cars tend to be much bigger than European vehicles. This presents some rather practical difficulties, like fitting in parking spaces designed for smaller vehicles, and, of course, Europe's old cities, accommodating the new world's big gas guzzlers. American car safety rules tend to be less stringent. The EU has strict crash standards. Cars are tested for pedestrian survival, and hoods or bonnets must absorb head impacts. US cars also tend to be less fuel efficient. Europeans pay around twice as much for gas as American drivers, making those American SUVs rather unattractive. And the United States and the EU have different emissions targets. There are 320 low emission zones across Europe, while the United States only has one. And that's boosted demand somewhat for electric cars in the EU, and US car makers lag behind when it comes to EVs. Well, let's talk now to Anne-Marie Baisden, the head of autos and infrastructure research at Fitch Solutions. Anne-Marie, good to see you. Donald Trump telling us to buy more American cars in Europe. Why is that not happening?
Well, as you're alluding to there, the dynamics in the market between the US and Europe are very different. Europe has always traditionally been more of a small car market. I would say in the last decade or so, we have definitely seen a shift towards SUVs, but this tends to be crossovers or compact SUVs. As you were saying, in the US, it's a tendency towards much bigger SUVs and pickup trucks. So there's that difference in dynamic there. A lot of production in the US is for the US or the North American market. It suits that consumer demand better. And also the difference in attitude towards EV. There's been a lot more support in Europe for EVs. Adoption in the US hasn't been as much as expected. We would expect that to get even less under a Trump administration, and so we're actually seeing some manufacturers in the US dialing back on their EV production. So again, that's not something they could target Europe with. So really, it is a matter of the two markets being very different.
So when Trump says you Europeans, you British must buy more American cars, you're suggesting the product simply isn't transferable?
Not all of them. I would say there are some that would work. And also, I think there's a question here about what is an American car, because, you know, if it's vehicles that are produced in the US, you've got European brands, you've got Asian brands that are also all producing there. Some of those would work, but, you know, maybe some of your higher-end performance cars, muscle cars, some of those would be in demand. But if you're talking about large-scale exports, then, yeah, very different consumer preferences.
Ultimately, the car buyer, the consumer, is king, isn't he or she? I mean, European car buyers just won't be told what to go out and buy. It's hard enough trying to get them to buy EVs, the manufacturers would tell you. So taking on what President Trump is telling you to buy might be a rather tricky sell, presumably.
I think you've hit on a really good point there. I think that's been one of the issues with EV adoption maybe not being as quick as was expected, because there's very much a regulatory push for that kind of thing in the EU and to some extent up until now in the US. But at the end of the day, it's what people want to spend money on. And that's why we've actually seen maybe more of a shift towards hybrids for that sweet spot between electrification but at a more affordable price point, not as much range anxiety, because that's what consumers want. So absolutely, what the consumer is actually asking for is what determines the market at the end of the day.
We spent much of the top of this programme talking about tariffs. Inevitably, I must ask you, given your background and your experience, what your team and your research is telling you about the impact of tariffs on the global automotive industry.
Well, absolutely for North America, if you look at the US, Mexico, Canada altogether, if the US did go ahead with the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which it has paused for 30 days, but if it went ahead and then there were retaliatory tariffs from Mexico and Canada on the US, we would see big increase in prices for vehicles, particularly for the components, which would then push up vehicle prices again because of the interconnectedness of the supply chain.